Chapter 19, Safe for Democracy, the United States in World War I, 1916 to 1920, Parts 3 and 4. Commenting on American intervention in the war, Randolph Bourne wrote that war is the health of the state. Bourne saw the expansion of government power in war as a threat, but most progressives saw it as an opportunity for reforming America and spreading progressive values across the world. Virtually all progressives rallied behind Wilson and the war, including intellectuals like John Dewey, journalists Walter Lippmann and Herbert Croly, and American Federation of Labor President Samuel Gompers, to name a few. Dewey told progressives to recognize the social possibilities of the war. The war created a national government with unprecedented power and an increased presence in Americans' lives. With the Selective Service Act of May 1918, 24 million men had to register for the draft, and the Army grew from 120,000 to 5 million men. New federal agencies were created to regulate industry, transportation, labor relations, and agriculture. A War Industries Board oversaw all aspects of war production, from distributing raw materials to setting prices for manufactured goods, and it created standardized specifications for nearly everything. The Railroad Administration controlled the nation's transportation, the Fuel Agency rationed coal and oil, and the Food Administration, directed by Herbert Hoover, helped farmers increase crop yields and promoted more efficient food preparation. These agencies generally saw themselves as much as friends to business as regulators, and they guaranteed government contractors a high rate of profit and encouraged cooperation among businesses by suspending antitrust laws. The War Labor Board, however, included representatives of government, industry, and the AFL, and instituted in some industries a minimum wage, an 8-hour workday, and protections for unions. Wages rose significantly in the war, working conditions improved in many places, and union membership doubled. Corporate and income taxes soared. With peace, this wartime state rapidly dissolved. But it momentarily gave progressives hope that government could rationalize the economy and society for the sake of justice and national purpose. Many Americans doubted whether America should intervene in a struggle between rival empires. Many outright opposed American entry into the war, as did groups such as Industrial Workers of the World and much of the Socialist Party. In April 1917, to counteract anti-war sentiment, Wilson created the Committee on Public Information, or CPI, directed by George Creel, to run a campaign to build support for the war. The CPI enlisted academics, journalists, artists, and advertisers to flood the nation with pro-war propaganda, from posters to movies. The agency trained and sent across the nation 7,500 4-Minutemen to deliver brief and standardized talks, sometimes in immigrant languages, to audiences at schools and movie theaters. The federal government had never before had an agency dedicated to manipulating public opinion, and future administrations mounted similar campaigns during World War II and the Cold War. The administration of the CPI made its appeal in a progressive language of social cooperation and expanded democracy. This meant a peace based on national self-determination abroad and industrial democracy at home. The CPI tried to sell the war to workers as a fight for democracy by promising the 8-hour workday after the war. Freedom was also a key term in the mobilization, and the CPI argued the war was being fought for freedom. The Statue of Liberty was a common image in wartime propaganda and was used especially to rally immigrants. The German Kaiser and the German nation and people were defined as the antithesis of freedom and depicted as barbaric and bloodthirsty Huns. Language of democracy and freedom inevitably sparked demands for their expansion at home. In 1916, Wilson seemed to endorse women's suffrage, but the war threatened to splinter the movement, as many in it opposed American intervention. Even the first woman in Congress, Jeannette Rankin of Montana, voted against American entry into the war. But most suffrage movement leaders and most women supported and participated in war mobilization, selling bonds, organizing patriotic rallies, and working in war production. A new and more militant generation of women's activists organized in the National Women's Party pushed for suffrage with tactics that scandalized older women activists, such as civil disobedience and demonstrations in front of the White House. But these tactics pressured the White House to fully endorse women's suffrage, and in 1920, the 19th Amendment, barring any state from using sex as a qualification for suffrage, was ratified. The war also enhanced other women reformers' campaigns, especially Prohibition. Several factors helped finally secure the prohibition of the sale of liquor nationwide, including employers' interest in a more disciplined labor force, urban reformers who wanted orderly cities and to dismantle political machines that used saloons, and women reformers who wanted to protect wives and children from domestic abuse and the squandering of men's wages for alcohol. Many native-born Protestants sought prohibition as a means to Americanize immigrants. Prohibition is first focused on state campaigns, which were successful in more than a dozen states, but the war made beer, often brewed by German Americans, unpopular. In December of 1917, Congress passed the 18th Amendment, prohibiting the manufacture and sale of liquors, and it took effect in 1920. The war showed that during a conflict, civil liberties are often imperiled. Randolph Bourne, in 1917, warned progressives that they would not be able to manipulate the war for their own liberal purposes, and that instead, the war would empower the least democratic forces in American life. Despite the Wilson administration's idealistic rhetoric, the war initiated the most extreme repression of civil liberties in American history. The federal government passed laws severely restricting freedom of speech. The Espionage Act of 1917 prohibited spying, interfering with the draft, and false statements that might impede military success. The Postmaster General banned from the mails radical and socialist newspapers and other publications critical of the war and the draft. The Sedition Act, passed in 1918, made it a crime to make spoken or written statements intended to cast contempt, scorn, or disrepute on the form of government or advocate disruption of the war effort. The government charged more than 2,000 people with violating these laws, and over half were convicted, the most prominent being Socialist Party leader Eugene V. Debs, who in 1918 was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison for delivering an anti-war speech. In 1920, Debs ran for president while still in prison and received 900,000 votes. He was released from prison by President Harding in 1921. More extreme repression was implemented by state government and private groups. Many states imprisoned those critical of the American flag, outlawed the possession of red and black flags, symbolizing communism and anarchism, and 23 states passed criminal syndicalism laws, making it illegal to advocate political change through unlawful acts or a change in industrial ownership. Patriotism came to be synonymous with support for the government, the war, and the American economic system, while anti-war sentiment, labor radicalism, and sympathy for the Russian Revolution became un-American. Local authorities investigated residents who did not buy Liberty loans. Schools revised their curriculum to ensure its patriotism and required teachers to sign loyalty oaths. The 250,000 members of the American Protective League helped the Justice Department identify radicals and critics of the war by spying on neighbors and carrying out slacker raids, stopping thousands of men in major cities and requiring them to produce draft cards. Private groups used the war as an opportunity to attack their enemies, as was the case with the industrial workers of the world, whose members were attacked, some even killed, and whose leadership was arrested. Even though some progressives protested individual incidents, most progressives did not challenge the general atmosphere of repression. Chapter 19, Part 4. Progressivism anticipated in many ways major 20th century developments, including the New Deal, the Great Society, and the socially active state. But by accepting race as a permanent and defining characteristics of individuals and groups, progressives were more like 19th century thinkers than 20th century liberals. What was called the race problem was a major subject of debate before World War I, and it referred to more than just relations between blacks and whites. In 1911, the U.S. Immigration Commission listed in one of its publications 45 different immigrant races, each with its own alleged innate characteristics, ranging from Anglo-Saxons at the top of the racial hierarchy down to Hebrews, Northern Italians, and at the bottom, Southern Italians, those apparently most violent, undisciplined, and incapable of assimilation. Popular writers asserted that the new wave of immigration and white women's declining birth rate threatened American civilization. The new Science of Eugenics, the study of the alleged mental traits of different races, lent scientific legitimacy to the new nativism. The nationalization of politics and the economy seemed to elevate consciousness of ethnic and racial difference and caused some to call for Americanization, the creation of a more homogeneous national culture. A 1908 play, The Melting Pot, gave a popular name to the process by which immigrants were expected to merge their identity with American nationality. Public and private leaders, including teachers, employers, union leaders, social reformers, and public officials, all engaged in Americanization efforts. The Ford Motor Company famously created a sociological department that entered immigrant workers' homes to examine their clothes, furniture, and food, enrolled them in English language courses, and fired those who failed to Americanize themselves. A few progressives criticized Americanization and demanded that Americans respect immigrant cultures. Reformers at Hull House encouraged immigrants to value their European backgrounds, and Randolph Bourne wrote in a 1916 essay, Transnational America, that there was no distinctive American culture. Americanization efforts took on a new urgency and became more extreme during World War I, and it especially affected German Americans, who numbered 9 million by 1914. Before the war, many Americans admired German culture, including its music, literature, and philosophy. But when America declared war, the German language and German culture became a target of pro-war organizations. German was banned in schools, German music was banned in many communities, and German terms became Americanized. Hamburger became Liberty Sandwich, for example. By 1920, German culture had been stigmatized and had receded from its previous prominence. Even while Americanization efforts sought to assimilate immigrants, the war reinforced the idea that certain kinds of undesirables ought to be excluded from the country. Some argued that the new immigrants appreciated democracy less than Anglo-Saxons, as they seemed more likely to embrace radical doctrines like socialism and anarchism, while others argued that immigrants and blacks' lower scores on IQ tests, invented in 1916 for examining army recruits, required restrictions. In 1917, Congress, over Wilson's veto, required that immigrants be literate in English or another language. 10 years later, the Supreme Court upheld laws authorizing doctors to sterilize the mentally ill to prevent them from reproducing. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, wrote Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. Americanization assumed that European immigrants, and especially their children, could eventually adjust to American life, adopt American ideals, and become citizens who enjoyed America's freedoms. This assumption did not apply to non-white immigrants or blacks who faced persistent exclusion. Wartime labor demands increased the immigration of Mexicans, who were exempted from 1917 literacy rules. But though Mexicans were legally considered white, state and local officials in Southwest discriminated against Mexicans in a system of segregation that affected schools, hospitals, and theaters, not unlike Jim Crow in the South. Although Puerto Ricans were conferred citizenship by Congress on the eve of World War I, and Puerto Rican men became subject to the draft and served in the war, Puerto Ricans were still not allowed to vote for president or have representation in Congress. Most restrictive were policies towards Asian Americans. In 1907, Roosevelt negotiated a gentleman's agreement in which Japan agreed to end further Japanese migration, except for the wives and children of men already in the country. In 1913, California banned all aliens incapable of becoming naturalized citizens, i.e., Asians, from owning or leasing land. African Americans, members of the largest non-white group in America, were excluded from almost all progressive ideas of freedom. They were disenfranchised in the South, barred from most unions and skilled jobs. Most black women worked outside of the home for low wages and jobs not covered by new state-level protections for working women, and most blacks, who were desperately poor, could not participate in the new consumer economy. Nearly all progressive intellectuals, social scientists, labor reformers, and suffrage advocates were unconcerned by conditions facing black Americans. The progressive presidents shared dominant racial attitudes regarding blacks. Theodore Roosevelt's celebration of Anglo-Saxon supremacy led him to call Indians savages and state that blacks were unfit for exercising suffrage. Not even Jane Addams, a founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, resisted the abandonment of a civil rights plank in the 1912 Progressive Party platform. Woodrow Wilson, a Virginia native, celebrated the South's genuine representative government. He imposed racial segregation in federal agencies in Washington, D.C., fired black federal employees, and screened at the White House the premiere of Birth of a Nation, a film glorifying the KKK as having defended white civilization during Reconstruction. Black leaders in this period tried to renew America's Reconstruction-era commitment to racial equality. No other leader did more to renew the movement for black freedom than scholar and activist W.E.B. Du Bois, a Massachusetts native and Harvard graduate. In his book, The Souls of Black Folk, in 1903, he called on blacks to reject the accommodationism of Booker T. Washington. Du Bois believed that educated African Americans like himself were a talented tenth who could use their education and talent to fight inequality. In 1905, Du Bois gathered black leaders at Niagara Falls in Canada and launched the Niagara Movement, which demanded the restoration of black rights to vote, an end to segregation, and complete equality in economic and educational opportunities. The agenda of black struggles for racial justice for the rest of the 20th century. In 1909, Du Bois joined with mostly white reformers to organize the NAACP, which launched a legal strategy to win the enforcement of the 14th and 15th Amendments that at first accomplished little. Among black Americans, wartime talk of freedom sparked hopes for radical changes in race relations. Most black leaders saw American participation in the war as an opportunity to win freedom for blacks at home. Du Bois himself called on African Americans to close ranks and enlist in the army, believing that black sacrifices would earn them rights upon returning to America. But this didn't happen, as the Navy barred blacks entirely and the segregated Army assigned most of the 400,000 black soldiers who served to supply units rather than combat. The war sparked social changes that transformed American race relations. Increased war production and a sharp decline in European immigration made available thousands of industrial jobs to blacks for the first time, inspiring a mass migration from the South to the North. When the war began, 90% of American blacks lived in the South, and most northern cities had small black populations. Between 1910 and 1920, 500,000 blacks left the South, moving to large cities like New York and Chicago, and smaller cities such as Akron, Buffalo, and Trenton. The desire for work and higher wages, education, and escape from the threat of violence, and the vote motivated African Americans to migrate. Yet these migrants encountered considerable disappointments, including limited employment opportunities, exclusion from unions, housing segregation, and outbreaks of violence. Dozens of blacks were killed in a 1917 riot in East St. Louis, Illinois, where blacks had been recruited to weaken unions. In 1919, more than 250 people died in riots in northern cities, most notably in Chicago. But racial violence also exploded in the South, where in the year after the war, dozens were lynched, including black veterans who wore their uniforms, and striking black sharecroppers were massacred by white vigilantes. The worst race riot in American history occurred in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, where more than 300 blacks were killed and thousands made homeless by a white mob, including police and National Guard, after black veterans tried to prevent the lynching of a youth who had accidentally tripped and fallen on a white female elevator operator, sparking rumors of rape. Racial violence during the war inspired a new spirit of militancy among African Americans. In northern cities, many blacks supported the Universal Negro Improvement Association, a movement for African independence and black self-reliance launched by Marcus Garvey, a recent immigrant from Jamaica. The Garveyites' idea of freedom was self-determination for blacks, who should enjoy the same international recognition as a nation as other peoples after the war. While Du Bois and other black leaders viewed Garvey as a dangerous demagogue and welcomed Garvey's deportation after his conviction for mail fraud, the Garveyite movement demonstrated blacks' sense of betrayal in the post-war period.